6. Okay, I think we're good to go. So welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining. When I prepared this talk, I was focusing very much on you know, how to tell you as much as possible about honey buzzards in half an hour or so, and I didn't think a great deal about what it's like to study them. And what it's like is would be rather like looking at a picture as this one, but without the honey buzzard in it, because they're very tricky birds, and you can spend many hours watching them, watching for them, and not seeing them. So why are they so tricky? Well, there are at least 4 reasons I can think of. One is they're very scarce birds in Britain, as I'm sure you know. Secondly, it's best to think of them as forest dwellers. They spend a huge amount of time below the canopy of the trees, unlike common buzzards, for example. So if you think of them in that way and you're watching for honey buzzard for hours on end, just remember they may be lurking there just under the tree cover, and it's just that you can't see them. And of course, another reason why they're difficult is, sorry, I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. Another reason why they're difficult is that they're only here for 3 months of the year, or 3.5 months of the year. So you've got a very short window of opportunity to see them. And for 40 days of that period, one of the adults is going to, if they're breeding, is going to be down on eggs, incubating the eggs. So you've got a kind of 50% chance of seeing a bird. And actually in that period, when there are eggs, it's generally very difficult to see females. I personally myself generally only see males, if I see any at all. So they're tricky for all those reasons. And of course, there's a huge amount of sensitivity around the sites where these birds occur. So taking together, that means that they're difficult for people to get good views of very often, although there are some viewpoints that are publicized nowadays. So I'm just going to introduce you to the honey buzzard, and just to start here, this is a male bird with its dipped-in wingtips and very dark trailing edge to the wing. I'll say a bit more about sexing honey buzzards in a moment, but I'll start by just comparing honey buzzard to common buzzard. That's a good point to start with. So first of all, it's got a smaller head, it's a kind of narrower head as well, more protruding maybe, but smaller than a common buzzard's. It's got a longer tail, and incidentally, it's got a very distinct tail pattern, usually, at least the adult birds, with that terminal band, and there's 2 other bands, thinner bands, that are hidden by the wing there. It's also a slimmer bird than a common buzzard, and in some views that can be really obvious. And it also has a relatively larger wing area, and that's a somewhat more subjective issue. So why is the honey buzzard so unique? Because it is unique. Well, that's because it preys very much on wasps, not exclusively, but very much on wasp larvae. So there's the Dutch name, wasp thief, the German name, wasp buzzard, the French name, bee-eating buzzard, and the scientific name, bee-eating hawk. So it has a unique ecology amongst British birds. So I'll say a little bit about where they occur. It's the European honey buzzard, so not surprisingly, its main range is within Europe. However, it also occurs in Western Asia. That's the area just east of that black line going down through Russia. And I guess that most of that is actually within Russia. It's a bird of least concern to the IUCN. Its European population could be around, nobody really knows, but perhaps around 170,000 pairs. If you include the Asiatic population, well, then maybe there are 200,000 pairs. The UK population in that context is kind of vanishingly small. It's only maybe 0.5% of the total world population, but nevertheless, it's an important population for us who live in Britain. And happily, it does seem to have been increasing in recent years, perhaps most notably in Scotland. They winter in Africa, as you can see there from the grey area within Africa, And by the way, the young birds, when they arrive in October, November in Africa, they'll stay there for their entire first year. And it won't be until the year after that, in April, that they'll start heading northwards back to Europe. I should also mention that in other parts of Asia, there's a kind of sister species, the Oriental honey buzzard, which is slightly different. It's got, if anything, slightly broader wings. It's got an extra protruding primary finger. And where their ranges overlap, they do seem to hybridize a bit. And those hybrids are seen from time to time, perhaps mainly in the Middle East. They're extremely difficult to identify. And Oriental honey buzzards can be seen very easily at migration watch points, for example, at Cao Din Saw on the Thai Peninsula, where I took that photograph there. But to talk about the migration route of the European honey buzzard, well, the Western breeding population come up from West Africa and they cross through the Straits of Gibraltar in very large numbers in April and May and travel up through Spain, and the British breeding birds will then come across the Channel. Then a more central population will come across from Tunisia, that's number 2, to Sicily, across the Straits of Messina and up through Italy. And then there's this huge migration watch point in Egypt and Israel that's very famous, Eilat, of course, known to many of us. There's a massive population that goes through there each spring and autumn, although the spring movement is better seen further north in Israel, I understand. But you can see there up to 400,000 birds. And when those birds get a little bit further north, they some of them fork off west and go through the Bosphorus, that's 4 there, up into Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. And then some of them go through the Caucasus, that's 5, at Batumi. And the Batumi site is relatively recently discovered. And it's especially good in autumn, where the birds get concentrated on the Black Sea coast. And you can see on the right there, up to 530,000 birds have been counted. And no map showing the migration routes would be complete without showing Falsterbo, this Swedish migration hotspot where large numbers are seen in the autumn. And I'm sure some of you have been to Falsterbo. So I just thought I'd show you this map of the movement of a female satellite tagged honey buzzard. Now, remarkably, she only left southern Africa on the 20th of April and arrived in Finland on the 2nd of June, having traveled 10,000 kilometers. Now, in Britain on the 2nd of June, some of our summer visitors will already have fledged young. So she's arriving really, really late. And I'm sure you will have guessed that the reason she's arriving so late is that in the breeding season, she's going to be very dependent on wasp larvae. So she has to allow time for the colonies of wasps to develop. And you'll see that a little above halfway through Africa, she's gone through South Sudan. Now, I used to live in South Sudan. I was there when it became independent. It's actually the world's newest country, although it's in great difficulties at the moment, I'm sad to say. And on that late date of the 29th of April, I saw flocks of honey buzzards migrating northwards along the White Nile. So I was amazed to see them at all, because I've actually lived for about 9 or 10 years in sub-Saharan Africa, and I've very rarely seen any honey buzzards at all. But remarkable also that these birds appear to be following the river northwards. There were other birds migrating up the river. This is a flock of white-winged black terns, and in the 3 hours that I was watching there, 6,000 of them passed, the largest flock being 2,000. Well, that's a little diversion, and I'll go back to honey buzzards in a moment. So there's the terns. So I'm going to say a little bit more about how to sex honey buzzards. So if you remember the previous slide showing the underside of the wing of a male honey buzzard, those diptonic wingtips and the dark trailing edge to the wing, that's characteristic of a male bird, particularly the dark trailing edge to the upper wing. A female will show rather dark colours all across the secondaries. And those dipped in ink primaries you can still see on the upper parts, but not quite so well. You can see the distinctive tail pattern there that both sexes have. and the grey on the face identifies a male honey buzzard. Females are very similar, but the head usually doesn't have any grey on it. It may have a little bit, depending on the age of the bird, perhaps. But it doesn't have that so clearly demarked dipped and ink wingtips and not such a clearly demarked trailing edge to the wing. So generally they can be separated. They also tend to have barring further out on the primary feathers, which you can just about see on this bird. But it has to be said that some females do look very like males, so they're not always easy to identify. And that's just another picture, closer picture of a female honey buzzard. And you can see there she's got an all brown head, and a male would never show a head as clearly brown as that. So how do you identify the species when they're flying around? Well, I'll start with the most important characteristic of a honey buzzard, and that is that it soars on level wings. They're often rather rigidly set out to the side, as this photograph suggests, and that is a very good way, the best way of identifying honey buzzards when they're flying around. Very occasionally a common buzzard will soar on level wings. It's usually one individual bird, and if you go back to the same place, you'll see the same bird flying around on apparently level wings. So very occasionally you will have that problem, but by and large this is a really, really good identification feature. So is it easy to tell them apart? Well, one of these is a common buzzard and one's a honey buzzard, and there are really four factors that determine whether you're going to be able to tell them apart. One is the distance you are from the bird. Secondly, the manner in which the bird is flying, and whether it's flying away from you, for example, that's not going to help. The duration of the observation and your own experience of the species. And even for experienced honey buzzard watchers, it's not uncommon not to be able to identify a bird that you see. So there's no shame in putting it down as a buzzard species. I thought I'd show a picture that sort of almost exaggerates the difference between the two species. So the bird on the right is a male honey buzzard with those dipped and ink wingtips and the dark trailing edge and the lack of barring on the flight feathers. And it's got its tail fully fanned and its wings fully spread. So it's kind of all wings and tail, slim body, slim head. And by comparison, the buzzard has got narrower wings, a kind of dumpier head. The tail pattern is completely different, although a juvenile honey buzzard can have a tail pattern that resembles that. So that's how different they can look, but they don't always look that different. And the other thing to say about identifying this species is that their plumage is extraordinarily variable. So that one end of the spectrum, you've got birds that are almost completely white on the underbody and the underwing coverts. Like this bird, this is a male. I'm sure you can tell now by the dipped and ink wingtips and the dark trailing edge. It's also got a grey head, or it's a little bit more difficult to see in this photograph. Now that's a bird at the kind of pale end of the spectrum. And this amazing picture, which was taken by Dorian Mason, is a female at very much the darkest end of the spectrum. I've personally never seen a honey buzzard that looks like this, but a really, really dark bird. But you can still see that she hasn't got a clearly demarked trailing edge to the wing, and she's got barring that goes right out onto the primary tips almost. So definitely a female. The other thing to say about this picture is that it's a bird in the breeding season in Britain, and it's in wing molt. It's actually completely molted its first two primaries on each wing, and it's molting its third primary, and the other ones are not yet molted and look tattier. And it is the case that honey buzzards will molt gradually through the breeding season, and it doesn't affect their abilities to hunt and bring up their young at all. And it seems to be a strategy that works for this species. I'm not going to talk about juvenile honey buzzards now because they're very, very difficult to identify, or can be. I get tripped up by them every year. I'll come back at the end and say a little bit more about juvenile honey buzzards. So I'm now going to talk about what happens to the birds in southern England when they arrive. The first thing to talk about is where they actually arrive, where they go. Well, in this part of Britain, they prefer mature mixed coniferous and broadleaf woodland or ancient broadleaf woodland by and large. That's where you're going to find them. And if you're thinking, well, there's an awful lot of that in southern England, you're right. And it's a mystery really that nobody understands why there's so much habitat and so comparatively few honey buzzards. But anyway, that is the case. So what happens when they arrive? Well, they'll get here in the second week of May. Some will get here a bit earlier, perhaps. Some will get here a bit later, but around the middle of May. And if it's an experienced bird, it will go back probably to an area it's bred successfully before, and it may meet up with its own mate or find a new mate very quickly. And if that happens, they'll fly around together in a kind of synchronized display flight. There are two honey buzzards in this picture, I promise you, and they're a pair and they're soaring around together near where they're going to breed. And this is in May. If, however, a younger bird arrives, and honey buzzards may not breed until they're between 3 and 6 years old. So a younger bird, well, it may not be paired up at all, or it may pair up and not breed. It may pair up and the pair build what's called a summer nest. So they go through the motions of nesting, but don't actually nest. And of course, experienced adult birds may come back and find that they haven't got a mate either, because the mate has died on migration or in the winter quarters. So this pair didn't display at all, and I'll talk now about the display of the honey buzzard because it's very remarkable. They've got an extraordinary wing quivering display flight, which certainly an unpaired bird looking for a mate will do. And what they do, they're soaring around in the sky and they'll accelerate very fast and then kind of jerk upwards, quivering their wings above their heads. And they'll do this many, many times if they're looking for a mate. So it's not uncommon for a bird to wing quiver about 80 times in a row. And this is an example of the sort of situation where a bird could be visible for a long time, perhaps for over an hour. A paired bird may display as well. So if, for example, it can see a honey buzzard in an adjacent territory, perhaps an encroaching bird, it may display at that. But by and large, paired birds are unlikely to display as much as birds which are looking for mates. And this is a series of photographs. It's actually from a video taken by Simon Lillington. And if you look, every fourth photograph, the wings are held above the head of the bird, above the body of the bird, in the sort of maximum height of the quiver. It's the most extraordinary display. It's unlike that of any other bird that I know, at least. It's certainly completely unlike that of any other British bird, and it really is a joy to watch. Unpaired honey buzzards have got another trick up their sleeves, apart from displaying like that, and that is to go and catch a frog and fly around with the frog and even wing quiver with the frog. So this bird would, which was unpaired at the time, would display and drop its talons whilst its wings were quivering above its head. So the frog, or the bird and the frog could be seen, I don't know how many miles away a female honey buzzard might have been able to see this male bird, but I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 miles. And this bird had actually nested successfully in 2016 and 2017. And in 2018, he couldn't find a mate, and he spent hours literally doing this wing quivering display with the frog and didn't find a mate, although he stayed the whole summer. And last year he came back, and I thought he'd go through the same thing again. And quite late in the season, in very late May, happily he did find a female and nest successfully. Sorry, that was in 2019 he nested successfully. 2018 he didn't, and 2020 he also nested successfully. So hard work paid off in that case. So I'll stick with common frogs for a moment. So the incubation period of honey buzzards is about 40 days. And when the young are small, the wasp nests are not sometimes well enough developed to provide all the food that the young need. And frogs can be very important. Other reptiles as well, and other prey, but frogs can be very, very important. And this bird is actually carrying a frog. The other reason it's worth showing this picture is that I don't think you'd ever mistake that for a common buzzard. It looks more like an accipiter. And that goes back to what I was saying about how slender the body of a honey buzzard is. They're really quite distinctive in a view like that. But of course, their primary food is wasp larvae. And this is a remarkable picture taken by Jiří Bodal, who's a Czech photographer, of a honey buzzard exploiting a wasp nest. Well, you can't actually see the nest in that photograph. It's one of my favorite pictures of honey buzzard. And you can see there that it's not the slightest bit bothered by all those wasps around it, as we would be. How do they find wasps? Well, this is a terrible picture, but it's possibly a unique picture. I took it last year, and it's something that in hundreds of hours of watching honey buzzards, I've only ever seen this twice. So the bird is flying around, maybe quite high, maybe not, and it suddenly goes into this remarkable, very fast diving, zigzagging movement and disappears within the canopy, and you don't see it again. And I'm assuming that it's seen a wasp and it's following it back to the nest. It's a remarkable thing to see. It's almost like the bird's been stung by a wasp because the movement is so sudden and so rapid. So what do they do when they find a wasp nest? Well, it depends what species of wasp to start with, but I'll talk about the common wasp at the moment. This has quite a large colony that's formed underground, and the honey buzzard will dig an entrance out such that it can reach the nest, and the hole that it digs is quite tidy. It's nothing like the damage caused by a badger, for example, digging out a wasp nest. And the other difference between a badger and a honey buzzard is that the honey buzzard will harvest the nest. So it will take some of the comb and leave the rest of the nest, and the wasp will rebuild the nest, and so that the honey buzzard can come back and harvest the nest again. Whereas a badger, it may not completely destroy the nest, but it will do a lot more damage than a honey buzzard will do. So how do they manage to exploit wasp nests without getting stung? Well, first of all, the legs and feet are heavily scaled. Secondly, the feathers around the bill are dense and scale-like. And then, well, their bill is very suitable for picking up insects, but their nostrils are designed in a way that minimizes the risk of being stung or wax getting in or soil getting in. So thanks to the Roy Dennis Foundation for that information. And here is a picture of a honey buzzard. It's the only picture I've ever seen actually of a honey buzzard with wasp comb that it's just taken out of the nest. But a couple of days ago, I came across a video on Twitter, and I strongly recommend you take a note of this. This talk is being recorded, so you can find out later if you want to go back to this. But there's an amazing video of a honey buzzard digging out a wasp nest. I thoroughly recommend that you watch that. So the bird has taken the comb, maybe 2 or 3 bits of comb, and it'll take it back to its nest. This is a bird that I watched last year, and it was regular as clockwork. It was traveling 5 kilometers between its nest and the wasp nest, or group of wasp nests, and regularly bringing back pieces of comb to the nest. This is another male bird. And here is another much better picture. This is by another Czech photographer, Jan Sevčík, showing another male honey buzzard taking comb back to the nest. Now, I'd always assumed that when honey buzzards were taking comb back to the nest, they would not be at any risk from any other birds. And sometimes honey buzzards seem to be living in a kind of parallel universe. So whereas a common buzzard, if it's flying around, may well be mobbed by crows. In fact, it's very likely to be mobbed by crows. I've actually never ever seen a honey buzzard being mobbed by a crow. It seems to, happily get on with its own life, and for most of the time, other birds, at least when honey buzzards are flying around, seem to ignore it. There are exceptions to that, however, and one exception I saw last year when I was studying a nest, and this male honey buzzard was gathering comb and taking it back to the nest. And it was a bit cocky. It would be flying quite high. It was really obvious. And on one occasion, this red kite came down and basically mugged it, and the honey buzzard had to drop the comb. I'd love to be able to tell you what happened to the comb, whether the red kite went down and ate it, but I decided to keep my eyes on the honey buzzard. And that turned out to be really interesting, because this male bird just circled around once or twice and then went straight back in the direction that it had come from. And in a very short space of time, only about 15 or 20 minutes, it came back. But its manner of flight was completely different. This time it came through just skimming the treetops or even below treetop height. And if the nest was due north, it was going northwest, really, really low and really fast. And it disappeared into a wood, nowhere near the nest. And then about 5 minutes later, it came out again and flew off northeast, again, not in the direction of the nest, and disappeared out of sight. And then it must have zigzagged back northwest again and got to the nest. And this is not uncommon with this species. It can be really tricky to follow to the nest if you're trying to study them at the nest, because they can lay false trails, so to speak. But it was very interesting to see this bird do this. And I don't think it was ever caught out by that red kite again. So I'll just say a little bit more about, this is not an area where I have very great expertise, so I'm really just going on what I've read. They prey on different wasp species. Common wasp is probably the most numerous species taken, but they also prey on red wasps and also German wasps and other species, including remarkably the hornet. There is some evidence that early in the season they may go for the smaller nests of other species other than common wasp, which are closer to the surface and or above the surface, even in the case of some species, and easier to exploit. But the deeper but larger nests of the common wasp seem to be more important later in the season. And they do take bumblebees as well, bumblebee larvae from bumblebee nests. But that is much, much less common. It's a tiny fraction of the amount of wasp comb that they take. And they do take other prey as well. This is one of the most remarkable pictures I've ever seen of a honey buzzard. This was taken by Dorian Mason, and you may be thinking it's preying on a rubber duck. I think what that actually is a wood pigeon squab, and they do take wood pigeon squabs, but it's very rarely been observed to the best of my knowledge, and I've certainly never seen another photograph. So thanks to Dorian for that amazing photograph. So I'm going to say a little bit about nests now. This nest I found a few years ago, and it's one of the only occasions when luck was with me. I decided to travel quite a long distance to what looked like a good viewpoint. And when I got there, I thought, well, this is a really rubbish viewpoint. I think I'm wasting my time. And 15 minutes later, a male honey buzzard flew almost over my head carrying comb. And it turned out I was standing about 250 meters from this nest, which was very easy to find. I should say at this point that I work under a Schedule 1 license. So this nest was in an oak tree, and honey buzzards can nest in a very great variety of trees, but oak is pretty popular, and Douglas fir is as well. I won't name all the species they nest in because it's a very, very long list. And it's very important not to be too not look at their choice of tree through humans' eyes, because, for example, you could be in a large area of mature conifers like spruce and Douglas fir, and the honey buzzard will have nested in a birch tree, a relatively small birch tree. So, you know, it's dangerous to think, oh, that nest looks good for a honey buzzard. You might well be wrong. So finding nests is usually pretty difficult. You know, they're deep in woodland, and there's only so much you can learn from outside the wood. And they leave very few telltale signs on the ground. So if you find a goshawk nest or a buzzard nest, you'll see lots of white splashes on the ground below the feces of the young birds. But the young honey buzzard produces very little of that, and so there's very little trace of the birds on the ground, although what you can find sometimes is pieces of comb and pieces of foliage from other tree species. And if I move to the next slide, this is a picture of the same nest closer up, and you can see that there's fresh foliage on it, and that is very typical of honey buzzards. You will find foliage from fresh foliage on the nest, and very often foliage from other species of trees. So it's maybe a little bit difficult to see here. I don't know whether you can see my arrow, but that there is birch, and then here there's pine. And when you see something like that, you can be fairly confident you've got a honey buzzard nest. As I said, this nest was in an oak tree. And as I mentioned, Douglas fir is also a very popular tree for nesting in. This nest must have been used for many years because it's looked to me almost like a white-tailed eagle's nest. It's absolutely massive. And you can just see the female there sitting on the nest with that eye. It's just visible there at the top of the picture. So sometimes the nests are relatively easy to see, but as I said, they can be extremely difficult. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about ringing honey buzzards. So when the young are still quite small, there's been a research program going on since the 1970s, led by Steve Roberts, who some of you may know, ringing young honey buzzards around the country. And under license, obviously, people climb the trees and take the young birds down in bags, and they're ringed and taken back up the tree. And I should say at this point that there's been a lot of research done, and camera evidence also shows this, that the adults are extremely faithful to their young, and this has no effect on the breeding success. In fact, the only evidence suggests that nests that are monitored by humans have a higher rate of success. Remarkably, that's been found in, I think, Germany and possibly the Netherlands as well. So usually if an adult bird is sitting on the nest when the climber goes up the tree, the adult will fly off, but very occasionally it won't. And this is a picture taken by Steve Roberts of a female that decided she wasn't going anywhere. There she is. Maybe quite an old female. She seems to have diptonic wingtips and a dark trailing edge to the wing, but that's definitely still a female. It just shows you they can be a bit tricky. And if you look at the bottom of the picture there, you can see that there's a huge amount of wasp comb in the nest. So, and you very often see that the adults really don't seem to have any trouble finding comb at all, at least in normal years. As I'll say in a moment, sometimes it's a very different story. But more usually, when you climb the nest, the adult, when you get to the top, the adult will have gone, and there'll be two young there, quite feisty, but when you get them down to the ground, they're very gentle. And again, you can see some comb in the nest there as well, not quite as much. This nest was in a Douglas fir, and this nest was invisible from the ground. It was incredibly difficult to find, so that can happen. Some Douglas fir, it wasn't a particularly mature Douglas fir, it was very dense and really difficult to find the nest. So I'll say a little bit now about threats to nesting honey buzzards. I wonder if you can guess what any of them are. I'll start with goshawks. Well, goshawks and honey buzzards have coexisted for millennia, and they coexist in southern England now that goshawks have increased, and indeed honey buzzards have increased. But goshawks are known to take young honey buzzards, and they will kill adults as well. So they are something of a risk. Of course, the breeding season for goshawks would have finished by, say, mid-June or late June. So there may be less pressure on the adult goshawks to take prey back to the young. And certainly all the places where I watch honey buzzards also have goshawks, and there's a very high success rate with the honey buzzards. So it is an issue, but maybe not a really, really serious, not a showstopper. A much more serious problem when it happens is bad weather. And in southern England in 2012, the weather was very, very wet for very long periods of time. And most of the nests failed, most of the pairs failed. Although, funnily enough, the few nests that were successful were very successful in the sense that the adults had no problem finding comb and wasp comb and bringing it back. And maybe that was partly because there was less competition, who knows. Of course, one of the reasons, or the main reason for the sensitivity about honey buzzard breeding sites is that in the past there has been egg collecting, and who knows, there may still be egg collecting. So this is a risk that is really impossible to quantify at the moment. Interference from other honey buzzards, so birds that haven't found a mate can interfere with the breeding pair to the extent that the breeding attempt fails. And poor nest construction, you might be surprised, can be a problem as well. And last year I had first-hand experience of that. This is a nest that we found in a Douglas fir. I think it's the same nest that I showed you before. And as you can see, it doesn't really look like a nest. And so a fair amount of reconstruction had to be done by a human assistant, and it ended up looking much more like a proper nest. I went away that day without my shoelaces from my brand new boots, but I was happy that the nest had been saved. So that's a nice little story. And so, yeah, there are all these risks, but it seems that once a honey buzzard, a pair have produced eggs, there's a very low failure rate. So this is from a paper by Roberts and Law. Only 42 nests failing out of 364 nest studied. That's, to my mind, an incredibly low failure rate. I'm going to tell you two other little things about honey buzzards in the breeding season that I think are particularly interesting and important to know about if you're watching them. One is that breeding honey buzzards will, as I've suggested already, often be joined by visitors. These may be non-breeding birds or failed breeders, and it can happen at any time of the season. I've seen a nesting pair being approached by a female honey buzzard from somewhere else, and the female breeding bird got up off the nest and just shooed the intruding female away. And in general, these encounters are very gentle. There's no actual contact and no harm is done to any of the birds. This photograph is another example. The bird at the bottom and the bird at the top left are breeding males. They both had nests, and the nests were only about 2 kilometers apart, by the way, maybe even less. And the bird on the top right was an intruding male as well. And his appearance caused both the breeding males to get up and circle around with him. And they didn't show a great deal of aggression, hardly any. Although in this picture, that's the intruding bird on the left, and the breeding bird on the right has dropped his talons. So he is, you know, a bit on edge, I would say. But there's no risk, I don't think, or very small risk to the breeding birds from this kind of behaviour. But it is something to watch out for. And you may see quite large numbers, surprisingly large numbers of honey buzzards get up if something sort of spikes their interest. One occasion I saw a juvenile goshawk come out of a wood, and within 5 minutes there were 6 adult honey buzzards soaring over the goshawk, which was a pretty amazing sight. And another interesting thing to say about honey buzzards in the breeding season is that by August, when the young have just about to fledge, one of the adults may decide that they've had enough and just leave, and the other adult has to look after the young that's still dependent for a few weeks or a few days or a few weeks. And when I've seen that happen, the remaining adult has always gone a very short distance to collect comb, within maybe 1.5 kilometers. And I did wonder, had the adult kept those wasp nests in reserve, so that if they were left on their own, they wouldn't have to go too far to collect enough food for the young. But this photograph means quite a lot to me because it relates to a breeding site that I found last year. I found it very late in the season. I saw 2 adults, and I went back and I saw a juvenile, probably a second juvenile, and I thought I was going to have some really nice views of the adults before they left. But arrived about 8 o'clock in the morning, and at 8:30 this female came up and soared over my head 2 or 3 times, and then she went off south, and I thought she was going off to get some wasp comb and she'd be back in maybe an hour and I'd have nice views of her. But I never saw her again that day, and I went back I think at least 3 times afterwards, and I never saw her again. So I think this was an example of where the young were still dependent on an adult, or maybe had just become independent, but this was only on about the 1st of September, I think. So this bird went, and if the other adult was still there, that adult, the male, would have been responsible for looking after the young. Just a couple of other things to say about this picture is it also shows a bird in wing molt. You can see there that it's molting its inner primaries, and it's also got a rather grey head for a female and a rather clear trailing edge to the wings. So I kind of speculate that this may be an older female, but it is just that, speculation. This is another picture that means quite a lot to me. I've been studying a pair throughout the breeding season, and the young were flying around above the canopy. They seemed to be doing very well. And one day, one of them soared up really high, and it was clearly going to leave, and it went off due north, remarkably. And they do explore, of course, a bit when they're young, but I hope that he eventually went off south. But the other bird, a few days later, he also soared up quite high and then glided very fast south. And there was something about his behaviour. I thought he's not going to come back. And this picture was taken at the moment that he was about to disappear behind that tree, and I never saw him again. So I think he was off to Africa for his to spend the first 18 months of his life. So let me finish by saying a little bit about watching honey buzzards, and I also say a little bit about juveniles. This is Beachy Head, a picture by Lawrence Pitcher, who takes fantastic photographs of the birds and also of the landscapes of this area. So if you want to watch migratory honey buzzards in autumn as they leave Sussex in this case, Beachy Head is a pretty good place to go. You've got a reasonable chance if the weather conditions are like this. So sometime from late August through to early October. And from where this picture was taken is actually a good place to watch for them. But let me talk a little bit in more general terms about viewpoints. So if you want to try and find them inland anywhere in Britain, wherever you are, you need to find a high viewpoint overlooking suitable habitat. So the more landscape you can see, the more chance you have of finding a bird. And pick these kind of conditions, certainly very good bright weather. You've got more chance of seeing the birds. And be patient. You need 3 things really: confidence, optimism, and patience. And you may need to wait maybe 3-4 hours. But hopefully, eventually, you'll be successful. Maybe not on the first day, maybe some other time. And you obviously do need good optical equipment, and I would strongly recommend taking a telescope as well as binoculars. But back to Beachy Head, so you will see adults leaving from here if you're lucky, and you may also see juveniles. This was a picture taken by Simon Lillington a few years ago. This is a juvenile, and so I'll say a little bit about identifying juveniles. They are really tricky. They do still soar on level wings, but their wings are just subtly different in shape from an adult and more like a buzzard. So it's easier to mistake them for a buzzard, and their plumage is rather nondescript. So just have a slightly closer look at a juvenile. This picture was taken by Glyn Sellers over the Straits of Gibraltar, and they do have this very characteristic 3 or 4 lines of barring across the secondary feathers. I think you can see there, and also very dark blackish wingtips. And the tail pattern can be quite variable. It can look a bit like an adult, or as in this bird, just have barring across it. And unlike an adult, which has a pale eye and a dark cere, the young birds have yellow ceres and dark eyes, as this bird does. As I said at the beginning, they're quite tricky birds, and literally every autumn or late summer, when I start seeing juveniles, I get confused by them. I think I'm wondering if I'm looking at a buzzard or at a honey buzzard. So they are much more difficult than the adults. And Dick Forsman, the world famous expert on raptor identification once called them the most misidentified birds of prey in Europe. And I think that may well be correct. So that's my last slide. And so I need to thank various people, Steve Roberts in particular, who's led honey buzzard research in the UK for many years, and the various photographers. I also want to say that there's a survey going on, a national survey, which started last year and is going on in this year as well. So if you see honey buzzards in Sussex, please let me know, because I'm the recorder for Sussex and I'm leading the survey, and other counties let the relevant recorders know. I'd be very interested in any records that you have, but do please keep these summer sightings in confidence, because there are still considerable sensitivities about the locations where these birds can be seen. So there we are. Thank you very much. I've managed to persuade Mike Scott Ham, a good friend of mine, to do the Q&A session. So I'm now going to pass over to him.
Thank you, Mark. Right, thank you for the talk. Excellent. A few questions come through, needless to say. Start off regarding food. Do they just eat or dig out nests on the ground, or do they take nests in trees as well, for example, tree wasps?
Yes, they do. That's the short answer. They take both. But as I suggested, later in the season, the nests of common wasps, which are large and underground, seem to become more important for the adult birds.
And then following on from that, do we know what they eat when they're in Africa?
I don't. I should have checked actually, but I have a very high degree of confidence that they're also taking larvae of wasps and bees. But I don't know that for sure. I better look that up. And I'm sure they take some reptiles and amphibians as well.
Yeah. Okay. Right. A few questions about where to see them. So just a general one, whereabouts in the UK? Obviously, there's a few well-known raptor viewpoints. Could we mention a few of those?
Yeah. So probably the most well-known one is Wycombe Forest in Yorkshire. And that's very easy to find by Googling it on the internet. And then there are sites in Norfolk and I think Nottinghamshire as well, which actually you may know more about than me. So if you know exactly where they are, please say.
I think it's somewhere around Clumber Park, but I don't know the name of the exact viewpoint.
Okay.
But it's a site from, I think, back in the 70s and 80s when they first turned up there.
Okay.
Right. Next one. What's the best time of day for seeing the birds at Beachy Head?
I don't go to Beachy Head very much, but I would, from what I know about honey buzzards, I would say from mid-morning onwards to maybe early afternoon. So once the sun has got up. That said, they don't need thermals. I once saw a juvenile honey buzzard in early October that got up from maybe the woods around East Dean, and it flew south over Burling Gap. And it was quite low. It was only maybe 30 meters above the cliffs, and I thought it would circle around to gain height. And it just went straight out to sea at about 8:30 in the morning in October. So they don't necessarily need thermals, but I suspect that most of them, and perhaps the adults, do prefer to have thermals to soar on and gain height. So you would have those thermals from about mid-morning, and I would personally watch until about midday or perhaps early afternoon.
Yes, I can add. I've seen birds sort of soaring up and decide that it's not quite right, and then disappear off back inland again. And the same birds were photographed then the next day when the conditions were better, and out they went. So, do the youngsters fly out with the parents?
No, actually, that's something that I should have made clearer in the talk. So, well, I did say that one of the adults may leave the young before they're independent, but it is generally true that the adults will leave slightly ahead of the young birds. So the adults will leave in in September. Many of the young will leave in September, but some of them will still be leaving in October. There can be exceptions. I think last year somebody photographed a juvenile at Dungeness in late August. So some of the juveniles may, if they fledge very early, may leave very early. But I think as a general rule, the juveniles leave slightly later than the adults.
Mm. And just again, adding something else, I think we've both been aware of situations where one parent's gone and left the other. It tends to be the male that gets left, the ones that I've seen. The females seem to be generally go earlier.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. I was kind of careful not to say that because my sample size is very small, but it certainly suggests that is the case. But it's not universally the case from the paper that Steve Roberts wrote in British Birds that I showed the picture of. That suggests that the males might leave as well.
Yeah. Another one here, I'm suspicious that honey buzzards fly all the way to their wintering grounds in Africa, having never seen them feeding in local woods in Spain. Do you think this is true?
No, it's just honey buzzards are cryptic, forest-dwelling birds. So if they're not on their breeding grounds and displaying, carrying food to the young, that kind of thing, they can be really, really difficult to see. So unless you're at the Straits of Gibraltar watching them coming in and out, or at another point where migrating birds are concentrated, you can quite easily miss them, I think. But they certainly don't fly all the way. They can fly very, very long distances, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, they don't need to cross at the Straits of Gibraltar. It's just easier for them. I think if an adult honey buzzard set out from Marseille, for example, in the south of France, I'm sure that it would comfortably reach the north coast of Africa. They've got a very high wing area to weight ratio compared with common buzzards. They can do really long sea crossings if they have to. That's known from satellite tagging.
Yeah, and I think if I can remember rightly, one of Roy Dennis's youngsters from up in Scotland went southwest and right out over the ocean and was flying for 3 days, a young bird, and didn't quite make it into France, but was presumed perished at sea.
That's right.
So even a young bird like that could fly for 3 days. It was remarkable.
Yeah, it's amazing. And another bird also tagged by Roy Dennis's team flew across the North Sea, I think from Scotland, and ended up in Germany. So yeah, they've got great powers of flight.
Indeed, indeed. Another one here, are pairs faithful to the same nesting sites every year, or do they choose different nest sites each year?
They might do either. So I've got a lot of experience of birds coming back to the same nest, but they might also move as well, sometimes quite long distances. So they might do both.
Okay, I think that's about it. There's a few more here which we can answer on the website later on, but I'm thinking at some stage when the birds are back in the spring, perhaps we could put something up on the SOS website, not telling people where to go looking for them, but perhaps a few hints and tips on when to go out, right weather, times and things like that, just to encourage people out into the field, as we've got a survey year this year, and it's a real good opportunity because the population is growing nicely now. And whereas I first saw my birds back in 1980, when they really were quite rare, now you stand a reasonable chance of actually finding your own.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the other thing I should say is that I hope that reasonably soon it will be possible to publicise a site for honey buzzards, at least in my county in Sussex. It can only be done really with the consensus of the people who study these birds. They've invested many years of their lives doing research, and I wouldn't want to do anything that they are not comfortable with. But I hope that will be possible.
Indeed, indeed, yes, wonderful birds. And yeah, if there's anybody from our neighbouring counties listening in, then I'm sure what we're seeing just isn't peculiar to Sussex. I'm sure Kent and Surrey, there must be something else going on as well. So yeah, the more get out there, the merrier. And I must admit, with the winter we've gone through, the thought of standing on a nice hillside in warm sun with a terrific view looking for raptors, it's a very pleasant thought at the moment.
Yes, indeed. And even if you don't see honey buzzards, you've got a good chance of seeing goshawks and red kites and hobbies and so on.
Yeah, and so with so many white storks flying around the county now, that's not out of the question.
Definitely, yeah.
White-tailed eagles tracking around the country, and perhaps even another visit from the one we now have to call bearded vulture. That would be nice, wouldn't it?
That would be good, yeah. Okay.
Anyway,
Mike, thanks very much for doing the Q&A, Mike. Much appreciated. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. These talks are going to continue for another 3 weeks, one a week. And the talk this time next week is by Jim Glover. It's going to be a really interesting talk about the development of conservation and the creation of protected areas in the beautiful Arun Valley in Sussex. So do come and join us, and do consider joining the SOS if you're not already a member, or maybe making a little donation. Thanks very much indeed, and hopefully see you next week. Thank you all.